Abarigani, Karibuni, and Asante for being here with us on Kumbukeni. Again, my name is Nduku. I am one of the co-hosts with my brothers, an African woman who has decided to join my brothers and sisters in countering the false narrative that has been perpetrated on Africa and Africans for years by Western media. And one way we are doing that is through Kumbukeni, by telling our story from our African perspectives. Brothers?
Yes, Akudede Woyi, as we will say in Yoruba, which is good evening from the United Kingdom. The name is Adesoji Iginla, the land of empire, the one that gives you all shades of opinion. As you can see over the course of the weekend, the match, the biggest all over the world.
Yes.
By all extension, all over the world. In estimates, conservative estimate of 800,000 people came out to say no, enough is enough in terms of our fight, just to underscore the importance of humanity. Yes, from London again, welcome again to another one, as we would say, the Open University. And Brother Allimadi.
Yes, Karibuni. To be honest, the turnout in that march, estimated at 800,000 or even more, in London, really reaffirmed my hope in humanity. The last several weeks has really, the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness as we watch the indiscriminate bombing of civilians. It's been very, very despairing, really. So to feel that there are human beings in London who actually share those kind of sentiments and feelings and outrage, it was quite heartwarming, to be honest with you. I've been to a few protests. I've been to the one in Brooklyn, opposing the indiscriminate bombing on Gaza. And the turnout was good. I went to the one in Washington about a week ago. The turnout was amazing. It was said that that was the largest turnout for protests in support of the people of Gaza in the United States ever. But then to see London top it off in such a massive way. So today I'm going to hold off on my critique of Comrade
Why is that funny?
As being in the belly of empire. This week, empire exonerated itself. So really, today I hold back my fire, comrade. So, Karibuni, sisters and brothers, friends from all over the world. I'm Milton Allimadi, based here in the United States with Sister Nduku, in the heart of the last remaining old empire. Welcome to today's conversation.
I'm going to say it's not the empire that redeemed itself, it's the people within, right? It's
yes.
The people who came. The empire is still as trifling as ever.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the correction.
Adesoji.
Yes, so this week we've decided in looking at the theme of what is transpiring in the world to take another look at settler colonialism. And this time we're going to the land of the Mosi in Tunya, and to the great uninformed, it would be what everybody knows as, oh my God, even having to call that name is, can you do me the favor?
Lake that was named by a queen or for after a queen that is not that.
Victoria Falls. Victoria Falls.
Okay, that is well. So
and I have major beef with Victoria Falls because, first of all, Queen Victoria was the one to whom, after Nyehanda, that woman general who led the first major resistance against European usurpation of their land in what is today Zimbabwe, after she was ultimately betrayed and defeated, and then she was executed by hanging, her head was severed by British imperialists and taken to the United Kingdom, supposedly as a trophy to Queen Victoria. And that falls, up to date, that amazing, beautiful, spectacular falls is still named after Queen Victoria, instead of after being named after General Nyehanda. So I have beef with that. But please continue, Tom.
Okay, so the name of the fall, as called by the local, is actually Mosi Intunya, the smoke that thunders, because apparently the sound alone you hear for miles. So it is the smoke that thunders. So yes, we're going to be talking about Rhodesia. Rhodesia, so named after Cecil Rhodes, had made the pledge that I intend to create an empire from the Cape to Cairo.
Mm.
And so lay waste to the land. The Ndembeles were the first to feel the brunt in the quest to get to Cairo. Subsequently, the Mashonas, but they will stop just at the northeast of said country, in a place called even the name they call it there was really problematic. They name this place Salisbury, and that name will become Harare, which is the capital city of the place at the moment. But we're not talking in present tense, we're still talking past now. And the reason we're talking past is in the course of our conversation, people should see that when settler colonialism goes out, there is a template that is followed. And that template, you would see, is still playing out till today. And so what do I mean by that? It is the decade, the so-called decade of African independence, the 1960s. And country after country was getting independence. Not Rhodesia, Zambia, which used to be called not Rhodesia, got its independence. The white minority government, the white minority settlers within Rhodesia, so-called Rhodesia, the name is interchangeable, it's Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. But in the course of our conversation, I'm going to be calling it Rhodesia until a critical point in time. And people will understand the reason for that. So Rhodesia, so-called, and these people decided to seize power. Now, they seize power based on the fact that there is an understanding that the Africans will not rule over them. And this was in contradiction to a statement made by Harold Macmillan in the 40s, following the Second World War, where he said in South Africa, actually, he said, and I quote, "It will behoove anyone to stand in the wave of the oncoming liberation of the African people." So even they understand it. Charles de Gaulle even understand it. So, but for the local settlers within Zimbabwe, they didn't quite read the memo, or maybe they read the memo and decide, you know what, we're going to ignore it, and who's going to hold us to account? And we should again understand the motivation for that happening. And so what then subsequently transpired is a machinations that, if you were to make a movie today, will be a bestseller. And so we began. An election was immediately called out of the blue after internal wranglings within the party at the time, the Rhodesian Front, wherein people were like saying, okay, it is time to consider majority rule. But there were a tiny minority within that party that said no, and decided, you know what, we're going to push out this leader who is considered a moderate, although
or a black people lover.
Well, that's one of the phrases they use for him. So, and we're gonna push him out in favor of this guy, Ian. So they pushed out Mr. Fielding, and they brought in Ian Douglas Smith. Ian Douglas Smith represented everything Mr. Fielding was not. He was what I would best describe as a nutter.
A white supremacist.
Generous white supremacist. Yeah.
So
even the name alone of the party, think about it. Rhodesia Front. That's very similar to the National Front that you have in the UK.
You would. So you begin to see commonalities. And so when I say templates, they know the template. Absolutely. They follow the template. For some reason, once we get something, we tend to look away from what has gone before. They study history. and they follow it. Everywhere you see the actions, it has been done before. And the reason why they're doing it now is because it succeeded in the past.
Yeah.
Let's try it again. And so Ian Smith then called an election, obviously white-only election, which they won majority seats. He then calls on the 11th of November, 1965. He then declares what is today known as a unilateral declaration of independence, effectively making Rhodesia a minority-ruled country, following in tandem with the policy of their southern neighbor, South Africa.
Right.
The world was obviously up in arms. The Africans within that country were not particularly pleased. And as we shall find out in the course, they took matters into their own hands. But there is one key thing before I pass it on to my co-host with a question, of course, is the fact that can anybody tell me what name these people who decided to take matters in their own hands were referred to in that time?
Of course, they were terrorists. And that is always the case.
So over to you. Over to you.
Everyone resists, white privilege. And
they've always been, right?
They've always been now. And this is an appropriate conversation, actually, because it allows us to examine contemporary events by the eye lens of our history, which is precisely the purpose of our podcast, Kumbukeni. So let's look at the difference, first of all. And they do this in a very clever way. In Rhodesia, they actually had the constitution they went by was initially the 1961 constitution before they came up with the Ian Smith constitution in 1965. So the constitution was actually a non-racialist constitution. So in theory, the Africans, the black people, were allowed to vote. However, they then imposed the land ownership requirement and educational requirement. That essentially meant only the European population
can
vote. Which made up, in 1961, I think it made up about 6.2% of the population. Only they were eligible to vote. So in essence, it was a racialist arrangement. Unlike South Africa, which just made it official, racist in 1948 with apartheid. So their version of apartheid was de facto, not de jure, not by law, but it was in essence 100% the same. So they have this. So Ian Smith then declares, as you said, unilateral declaration of independence, which also was modeled after the U.S. Declaration of Independence of 1776. And that was only the second time that a British colony was unilaterally declaring independence. Except in that case, they deleted the part about all men are created equal.
What did they put?
They just took it out. And of course, in the case of the U.S., even though it was there on paper, but it has never been in practice in the United States. So I think they just said, why should we pretend like the U.S.? Just scratch this out. So they take it out. So now the big question is, how was Rhodesia able to survive from 1965 all the way to 1980?
18.
Right? You're talking 15 years of apartheid in what was then Rhodesia. Number one, it continued getting full trade and economic support from apartheid South Africa. It continued getting full support and trade from Portugal, which of course, as you know, was one of the last European empires to be defeated in Africa. Not until 1974.
1974, yep.
Defeated militarily in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. And it also got considerable support from France. France, which is right now the raging mother of imperialism in Africa and being repudiated in West Africa. So the UN Security Council, first of all, the UN General Assembly had a vote about 107 to 2, rejecting and condemning UDI. The two countries, of course, that's opposed were Portugal and South Africa. France abstained. The Security Council passed resolution condemning, calling on all countries to cut off trade with Rhodesia, and it voted 10 to 0 in support of that. France abstained once again. So I want the world to know France has this long history of reactionary politics in Africa, as of course we see manifest today in West Africa. And also, a few reactionary African countries, even after the UN boycott, the OAU boycott, continued doing business with apartheid South Africa. I know Malawi was one of them, and I believe Kenya also clandestinely was doing so. And that's not surprising, as we see how Kenya abandoned the Kenya Land and Freedom Army after independence. And then I want to contrast with, and also another thing they did was they set up these shell companies. Rhodesia did in countries like Luxembourg, in Switzerland, in a place like Liechtenstein, and these shell corporations would then conduct normal business, just like a country actually, on behalf of Rhodesia. So that's how it primarily survived. And then I think it was in 1970, I'm trying to remember the year, I hope it's 1970, when the United States defied the UN by what was called the Byrd Amendment, which allowed the US to stop importing chrome from the Soviet Union and start importing it from Rhodesia.
Yep.
Giving powerful financial support to Ian Smith's minority racist government. And this was not repealed until Jimmy Carter became president. And it was ultimately repealed in 1977. So this is how Rhodesia was able to defy the international community. And of course, ultimately, it was Britain. The blame goes not to Ian Smith, really, but the blame goes to Britain. And why do I say this? Look at the contrast. When the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, they were demonized as the so-called Mau Mau, when they were fighting for their land, which had been stolen from their ancestors, the British declared them in rebellion, in treason, brought troops from all over colonial territories and from England itself to suppress that legitimate fight for liberation, killing, at that time was estimated at 10,000, but now numbers are going to possibly even 100,000 Kenyans died during that struggle. So look at the contrast. So compare that to what happened in Rhodesia. The British refused to abide by the request of what was then the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor of the African Union.
Yep.
The call that they should suppress that UDI militarily. They said, oh, the Ian Smith army was very well trained, very well equipped, and this would become, as Smith himself cleverly said, this would become a fratricidal war. In other words, within the family, kith and kin. And that is essentially why the British did not suppress that. That was the outright rebellion, actually, not the one in Kenya. That was not a rebellion. That was a fight for national liberation. So they refused to suppress that while they suppressed the legitimate one in Kenya. And thousands of Africans, of course, lost their lives in the course of that struggle until ultimately the 1979 Lancaster Agreement
Yep.
led to the elections in March 1980, which was then won by Robert Mugabe's party, and they had a government of national unity, him and Joshua Nkomo, who led the other major liberation movement.
So as you're talking, Allimadi, as you're talking about how they survived from 1965 to 1980, and I was looking at the numbers, the ratio of whites to blacks was 25-1, and just to help you understand what that looks like in South Africa, with the same case where the minority is leading, it was 7-1. So there were way more Zimbabweans than white people. And if
Correct.
Like when you think about it, if it's just between the Zimbabweans and these white people, they would have been crushed, right? But there are other parties that are playing in this, like Allimadi laid out, but also the US is a big part of this. And the one thing I found interesting, which is a true analysis, is at that time they're seeing Rhodesia and Ian Smith as a kinsman, right? Doing the same thing they did. Look at this brother of ours declaring independence from the king, from the empire. And so they're sympathetic, and they actually offer support because of that.
And holding back the savages, not only
holding back the savages. And in the course of those years from 65 to 80, the United States not only supports them with trade and everything, but they send mercenaries to Rhodesia.
Absolutely.
And that plays a big part in why
a very big part.
we end up suppressing the Zimbabwean uprising, at least trying to for a while. So and the funny thing, as I was doing this was very the research on this was very angering. I kept texting a few friends just. We've all mentioned Susan Williams' White Malice. That's one of the books I was looking at, and White Malice basically exposes the CIA for what it does. That was a big part of it too. The CIA was very involved in this. But speaking of the mercenaries, the United States government was very much a part of sending the mercenaries. But in order to distance themselves, and let me go back to the name, what they call them, they decided to call the mercenaries foreign military technicians. So just in case they're still using that term, so that the US officials could have deniability. Oh, are you sending mercenaries? No, we're not. We're sending foreign military technicians.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And that the sneak attack tactics of these.
Right. And the embassy, because most countries close the embassies, the US embassy was changed into a contact agency.
but before they do that, the CIA is working there because apparently to them it's an extraterritorial zone, and they find ways of ending up in it. Like what I'm trying to explain is the criminality of these enterprises, right? They claim law and order. They claim to call people terrorists, but they themselves always accommodate their terrorism, and they find ways of maneuvering and using their law, which is their opinion really, so we shouldn't all be surprised, to justify the things that they do. So yes, if it was just a fight between Zimbabweans and them white folk, that Ian Smith and they'd be crushed.
Right. And the other thing also is that Ian Smith also knew the politics, really. So he even had offered, even though President Johnson ignored it, he had offered Rhodesian soldiers to fight alongside American soldiers in Vietnam. In exchange for recognition.
Because Vietnam is happening at the same time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, that was quite tempting. And maybe that's something that was never closed completely by the United States. Of course, the US would have been aware of the backlash, particularly from African descendants here in the United States, and progressives, of course.
Yeah. The other thing, as you mentioned Vietnam, Adesoji, sorry, as you mentioned Vietnam, the thing that I saw about these mercenaries, these are the people like who are not doing well in their countries, right? They've lost all interest for life. You have people coming from the Vietnam War going to Rhodesia. So you have mentally unstable people.
Yes, absolutely.
And so humanity means nothing to them. And you can imagine the brutality.
Especially African lives. Yeah, so that's a very good
point.
Right?
Yeah, and it's mentioned that apparently the US mercenaries were the most brutal.
Exactly.
So that's something to note.
The most eager to get to the front line as well. You know,
Yeah.
they don't even
Yeah.
know any of the domestic issues. They know that the bad guys are the black folk fighting
Yeah.
against the white minority government. So I'm
Yeah.
glad you
Yeah.
brought that point out.
Yeah. And for them, they had no stake in the game. All they wanted was a time to go away from their misery. So it was like fun. It was play for them,
No,
which I found
it
very
was beyond
upsetting.
that. It was therapeutic.
Exactly.
I mean, okay, so you've segued into the point I was going
I'm
to.
sorry, Adesoji.
No. You segue into the point I was going to make, which was the question of the fighting itself. So the fighting didn't start until there was sporadic fighting in May of '66, but the fighting in terms of the declaration of open conflict from the Africans started in December. And again, this is where strategy comes into play. A very anecdotal story, but very true. It was so funny when I was reading it. So, a squad of 9 Zanla's gorillas. Zanla
African warriors.
is
I'm
no, it's
sorry.
short for Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army. So they crossed the border from Mozambique into Zimbabwe, into Rhodesia, from Mozambique into Rhodesia. And they make way for a farm about 64 kilometers from the border. This particular farm in particular. The name of the farm is Altina Farm. I mean, the irony, see if that is not enough. First and foremost, you have a Greek name in the African savannah. So things get interesting from there on. And they specifically aimed for the operator of that farm, Mr. Otto Butchgrave. He was able to escape, but they injured members of his family. Him and his first son escaped, and they go and raid, call for help. By the time the help arrived, the guys who carried out the attack had already gone. 12 days after that, they go back to this same man, but this time in another farm.
He
So
had
they knew.
multiple farms.
No, he went to hide with another farmer. Again, this farm is about 16 miles away from his own farm. So he follows on that. He comes to his farm in the course of the day, then he goes and live on that farm. And so they come. Okay, so the point I'm making with that anecdotal evidence story is the fact that the Zanla guys had heard stories about this particular farmer, that he was very abusive. And so in order for them to get volunteers, they focused on him. And the moment they focused the attack on him, farmhands began to build up what was then known as the intelligence whispering networks.
Exactly.
So they were able to keep tabs on everyone who was coming, who was going. And so sometimes, I mean, the beauty of the code, sometimes they make markings on trees to tell you who has been here. I mean, it's when I was reading about it, I was like, wow.
It reminds me of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, because that was a big part of what they did, the intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
When the
from
colonialists,
who are supposed to be devoid of intelligence.
right? When the colonialists paint them, they call them savages, and we follow that narrative and we think, oh, they don't have these sophisticated ways of doing war, but they did. Intelligence was a huge part.
Sometimes, I mean, in one of the stories there, sometimes it's a question of you're walking, you're heading towards a tree, and you see the tree has its branch slipping against the tree. And then the branch on the other side has been cut off completely. Apparently, it was to indicate to the fighters there that place has been mined. Go through this way. Right. And I was like, wow.
No, they're really organized.
Well, so organized. So speaking of organization, one way the Africans within and outside also organized was they were also very particular about making it a Black issue. So as much as possible, they try to keep that struggle out of the news. Why? Because even the UN ambassador for the United States, Otto Goldberg, said, and I quote, if the local population are to realize what is going on in Rhodesia, it will make it a very uncomfortable period for the Democratic the Democratic Party going forward. Guess who is in power now? And guess what the same Democratic Party is facing? So when I say history plays in tandem, it is the parallels are so, I mean, settler colonialism is a template. You just need to just watch and see the commonality at play.
Yeah, unfortunately, imperialism and capitalism, it's not even a question of being on the wrong side of history, because it has to be on the wrong side of history, unless, the system renounces imperialism and capitalism. And they always, this is a point I've used before on this show, and I use it again because it just shows how brilliant the late Julius Nyerere was, the president of Tanzania, when he told the interviewer that the world would be so much more advanced, a much more peaceful place if the United States had an opposition party. And the journalist was so confused. As I said last time, he said, "What do you mean, Mr. President? We have the Democratic Party and we have the Republican Party."
I'm glad you know.
And Nyerere said, "That's the problem. Both of them are imperialist and capitalist. You don't have an opposition." And that's the problem. And of course, ultimately, the politics actually played itself. And Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa started affecting and influencing US politics, as Adesoji alluded to, because African American sisters and brothers started rallying. And then European American progressives or left-leaning people who could identify with humanity started joining the global boycotts of South Africa and of Rhodesia. The young people on college campuses took up the divestment campaigns, making sure that they forced the universities not to have any of their holdings or investments with companies that were doing business with South Africa, or that were buying shares on corporations that were traded and had business presence in South Africa. So that was a very important component. And then, of course, the other very component that was critically important was the frontline states and the Liberation Committee of the Organization of African Unity. Yes, we lambast the OAU for many of its failures, but when it came to the liberation struggle of countries that were under colonial rule or countries that were ruled by white minority regimes, they did a spectacular job, not only in mobilizing global opinion and diplomatic support for the struggle, but also financial resources. So Africans can actually contribute to some causes when they identify that it's critical. Unfortunately, we have not identified other critical causes like the need for African unity and United States of Africa. But when it came to liberation in South Africa and Rhodesia, African countries actually remitted money they claim they don't have to the OAU for that purpose. And then, of course, countries like Tanzania, countries like Zambia, the frontline states, they provided military training and sanctuary for the guerrilla armies. And then we have to also thank, of course, the Soviet Union and China for also training the soldiers, training the officers, and also providing arms for those liberation organizations.
So I was going to touch on that aspect of the fact that you mentioned Democratic Party being in the course of that time between 64 and 80. you had both Democratic and Republican, just to go to Milton's point, right? You had leadership from both sides at that time. So it wasn't the fact that it was a Democratic Party leadership, or and not to mention, not on what Adesoji was saying, but what Milton is saying, that they are one and the same, and what Nyerere was saying. And to bring it now to contemporary times, it's not that a Democratic Party leadership is going to do this, a Republican Party leadership is going to do this. They are all one and the same person. They're all not only imperialists, they're racists, because they hold up capitalism based on racism, right?
Right.
And all of them, while the leadership was changing, the mercenaries were never taken away. They were still sending mercenaries to and supporting what was happening in Rhodesia. Correct. So and now bringing it back to today, what is happening, and Adesoji kind of hinted to it. What is happening in Palestine and Israel did not start yesterday or with Biden's leadership. No, it started before. Trump was already working on, and it's not just Trump. These people are always working and planning to maintain their power. And it has nothing to do with a certain president in leadership. It has everything to do with who they are as a nation. And so for us to think that, a Democratic leadership is going to be better, a Republican leadership is going to be better, no. The system has to be brought down. It's just as simple as that.
It's true. Even though there are exceptional instances, which is not frequent, when Jimmy Carter was president.
Yes.
And it shows you the power. Yeah. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
No, go on.
Because it shows you that individuals can actually, exceptional individuals can make a difference. Mm-hmm. Carter, and this is somebody who is from the South. Think about that. But perhaps that's actually what helped, because he saw and understood the nature of racism, having grown up in the South and having seen it with his own eyes and having repudiated it personally. So it took a person of that combination to come there and to actually implement a lot of these resolutions that the UN and the UN Security Council had implemented to make sure that the Byrd Amendment was repealed, to make clear to his own kith and kin in Rhodesia that no, we are going to support majority rule. And he made that the designated portfolio for Andrew Young. And Andrew Young pushed them aggressively to accept that the Lancaster Conference. And Carter did not consider the Nkomo or Mugabe as terrorists. They considered them as legitimate organizations fighting for national liberation and for independence. In fact, they went as far as to even say that the U.S. would also, because ultimately the British saw the writing on the wall. So the British said, okay, to once again appease their kith and kin, that they would provide financial resources to buy land after liberation, to buy the land from the minority white farmers. The U.S. said, if you're going to do that, the U.S. would also match it. This was the assurance that that Carter gave. And of course, the mother of imperialism reneged on that arrangement. The British never came up with the funds, and the U.S. had nothing to match since the British were not forthcoming. And at the end of the day, it was a British obligation anyway. But here's the other contrast that I wanted to make. In 1965, the British said, no, we cannot militarily intervene to reverse the UDI. But after Mugabe expropriated the land and started returning it to Africans, the British, under Tony Blair, urged Thabo Mbeki, then president of South Africa, to support a military invasion of Zimbabwe to reverse the land reform. The irony is just breathtaking.
I was going to say also, yes, Jimmy Carter, thank goodness for him, right? But because of him doing that, he was a very unpopular president, and he didn't last long.
Absolutely,
right?
He had one.
And I think for Jimmy Carter, it's the individual, because the argument is made that a lot of those U.S. Mercenaries or peoples who went and those who empathized or sympathized with Rhodesia were people from the South, were racists, right? So you have two different people from the same location, but having different response. I think for Jimmy Carter, it was the individual himself who has some empathy and not necessarily where he came from. But because of it, he was a very unpopular president, which goes to show you what the United States is.
Right. The system hated him, but the people really actually loved Carter as a person. If you do the polling, he's loved as an individual. He's been on the right side of history, including on the issue of Palestine as well.
And he will be very unpopular on that side of the world as well. So, in fact, he's considered the most unpopular president in that side of the world.
Right.
Now, going back to the issue of, you made mention of the Organization of African Unity, now called the African Union, backing the providing funds as part of the measures from the frontline states, was also the fact that majority of the students from not just Rhodesia at the time, but also South Africa, got scholarships in other African countries. And then when it comes to the fighting itself, countries like, because at that time, just like you said, Mozambique, which is northeast of Rhodesia, was still under Portugal.
Right.
And then the coup of 1974 that ousted the dictatorship in Portugal. And here's another funny fact. Is the fact that the government in Portugal at this time was being subsidized by the United States to the tune of about 400 million every year.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I'm glad you brought that point out, because that's a very very tragic,
exactly,
but not surprising aspect. It only adds to what Sister Nduku was saying in terms of the U.S. contribution in supporting and subsidizing apartheid and white supremacy, and the bloodshed that it inflicted upon thousands of ordinary Africans. The Portuguese were using napalm bomb, right? Support provided by the U.S. as part of Portugal being a part of NATO. So I'm glad you brought that point, Adesoji. Go ahead.
And so, which then brings me to this, and you will see the parallels I'm about to draw now. Once those camps were set up in the neighboring countries, the Rhodesian Air Force, armed by those you mentioned, would go across and bomb those camps. Does that sound familiar?
Very familiar.
Opposition leaders in places like Zimbabwe were assassinated at their doorstep. Sounds familiar?
Yep.
So you then begin to see, when I say
template,
you're still following the
right. And then they would do the same thing too. They would call Zambia and they would tell the president to instruct his Air Force not to resist.
That's it.
I'm glad you're bringing that up too.
And then they would not do anything, because Zambia's Air Force of maybe 6 or 7 planes
exactly
would not match the number of planes provided by the West to Rhodesia and to South Africa. Right. Yes. So they would allow the bombing to go. People would watch helplessly as thousands of people are killed, and then the planes would return to Rhodesia and South Africa completely unmolested,
And speaking of planes, as mentioned by name escapes me now, Dr. Susan Williams in a book, Who Killed Dag Hammarskjöld.
Right.
The UN plane carrying the UN Secretary General was actually shot down. I mean, it's still an open investigation, but initial thoughts were the firing came from Rhodesia.
Right.
And so, question is, why was that plane shot down? I mean, we could come up with so many reasons, but one particular reason that stands out to me the most is, just reading all of this, was the fact that he was his secretary generalship as the UN secretary tabled African affairs and made sure African affairs came up for debate.
Yeah, it was not seen as a puppet of Western interest and Western imperialism.
So for them, it was quite convenient for him to have been taken out of the scene. And then you mentioned earlier that France also supported the what's it called? France supported Rhodesia.
Right.
Let's not forget that there was a tiny country that was created for 6 months, just off the north, just the tip of the northeast end of Congo.
Katanga.
Exactly. There you go. So now you begin to understand why France was vested in Rhodesia being in the hands of the white minority government.
Correct.
As opposed to being led by an African majority one. So go on.
Right. No, I'm agreeing with you. It's a combination of the kith and kin, but of course, the major thing was resources too.
Yeah.
I mean, copper, the rich copper mines of Katanga. Copper was a major commodity at that time. And even today, copper remains a major commodity. And that is why they're willing to go to all measures to break up the Congo, kill a democratically elected African prime minister, shoot him up, cut him up into pieces, burn the body, crush the bones, dissolve the bones in sulfuric acid. But when it comes to reversing UDI in Rhodesia, oh, no.
That's too much. That's too
No. No, and we bring these issues up because we want to, of course, reject the demonization of Africa and African humanity and non-European humanity, I guess would be a better assessment, because it's not only African humanity that's dehumanized and then made. You know how back home in the village, when you visit, in the rural area, when they say, "Oh, this guest has arrived," and then you point at the chicken that you want to be slaughtered for you, and then the chicken is fed first. And I never understood that. They feed the chicken up first.
So that it doesn't know death is coming.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
In this case, we are prepped for extermination by the not just contemporary demonization, but historical demonization.
Yeah.
Think about it. So I think the better question I would pose is, and because somebody was posting something on social media, said, and the question was, is your attitude toward the Palestinians and non-Europeans not racist? And I said, a better question would be, have you not been socialized to see non-European lives as inferior to Europeans? And of course, the answer is yes. Nobody can deny that. That's how you're socialized. Whether you embrace it or reject it, that is a different issue. But in terms of socialization, and then I was thinking the flip side, of course, is non-Europeans have also been socialized to believe that European lives are superior
to theirs,
to the lives of non-Europeans. And that is why so many of our own sisters and brothers accept, rationalize, and even condone abuses of non-Europeans by Europeans.
Yeah. I was looking for a line I had read, I couldn't find it right now, of one of the former CIA agents on what their role really was. So for those of us who think that these people came to Africa because of racism, it's just a byproduct. It's mainly driven by money, trade. How can they withhold their power? And so you're talking about the Secretary General being killed, and before he is killed, he is being spied on in the UN, despite the fact that the CIA is not supposed to work within the United States borders. he's been spied on the whole time.
Correct.
So they're listening
Correct.
to every call. And the story goes that the equipment that they use in the UN was built by a CIA cover company, right? And therefore, it has been built in with spying material. So both the NSA and the CIA are spying on the UN at that time, and on the Secretary General. And the other thing I wanted to bring in too is both the UN and the State Department. And I didn't know this until I was reading this part of White Malice, that the State Department has a unit that is mainly for intelligence. I did not know that until this weekend. And so they too are influencing African leaders at the time. And they are recruiting, I guess, what you would call spies. They call them sources at the same time. So this UN Secretary General, who's doing what he has been assigned to do, negotiating with African leaders, speaking with them and trying and maintain peace, because remember, that's what the United Nations is supposed to be, is being spied on by his own country. And they're not agreeing with what he's doing because it's going to take away their advantage as far as trade goes from them. And therefore they decide, and it's not just the United States, it's Britain as well. This intelligence that was gathered through these equipments was shared between France, Britain, and the United States. Right. So when we start thinking of these nations and the imperialists as one nation, and we're attacking them as one, we make a big problem. We have to look at them as one entity, all of them together, because they all work together to keep us subjugated.
Right. So now you talk about the Secretary General of the United Nations. And to be honest with you, you know, people might say, oh, these things can't happen in the 21st century. Those are the things that they did in the 1960s. But Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General of the United Nations, has been very vocal and critical of the ongoing bombing in Gaza. So critical that after he made his initial statement, he had to come out the next day to make a statement to defend the previous day's statement. And you could almost see he was literally trembling. That's how shaken up he was. Said for anybody to interpret what I said, that the bombing is violating international law, should stop, it's killing too many civilians, to read that as an endorsement of what Hamas did against Israel, that is completely unjustified. And you could see the hurt he was feeling. So in order for him to come back and make that statement the next day, you can imagine how much heat he's been taken and how much hatred that he could be subjected to now. So I'm saying there's no guarantee that he's safe.
Oh, no, there's none. Absolutely not.
Absolutely, because I'm looking at what happened to who would expect that the Secretary General of the UN could be harmed in the 1960s. But that's how volatile those issues were back in the day. And that's how volatile this issue we're dealing with is today.
I mean,
so I commend him anyway.
Yes.
For having taken that position, which is part of his job anyway. But the other guy was also doing his job, was he not?
They will take down their own to maintain their power.
No, the thing is, you also have to understand that the role of the Secretary General has always been to be one that will parrot the popular position. And so they've oftentimes and not, they've chosen most of the Secretary Generals, they've been curated. With the exception of a few. Let me see, who would I say slipped through the cracks? Hammarskjöld will be one. Guterres will be another. The rest of them, Javier de Coila, Boutros, Hali, even.
And notice they're boys, by the way.
Even
no woman ever.
Yeah, that's been a problem.
Well, that's been
ever in the UN.
I agree with you.
Women's rights.
That's been a major problem. And Guterres, I think it helps that he's actually serving his second and final term.
Yeah.
See? If he was only in his first term,
no, he's not coming. He's not coming back.
Yeah, because that would have guaranteed that he would not get a second term.
I mean, there was the talk of Salid Ahmed Salim, the Tanzanian.
There was the talk of Olara Otuno.
Yeah, no,
Uganda.
I was actually coming
And
to him.
you know who blocked that?
But I also
believe
thought
it?
they were talking
He
about
was
Miyamoto.
blocked by his own
Government.
countryman, by dictator Museveni.
Salim Ahmed
You
Salim
know?
was blocked. Salim Ahmed Salim would have been one of the, in fact, he would have been the first because he's 79, 79.
Right, the Tanzanian, right.
Yeah, the Tanzanian. Brilliant orator, brilliant. But again, the Americans said if they put him forward, they will not support him. And he said, okay, you know,
Yeah,
I
because
understand.
he went to a meeting and called them white man. And they were like, nope, this is not your typical one.
And so essentially the fact that they've already seen the fact that he was a Pan-Africanist because he served as Secretary General for the OAU. So they said, okay, why not put him forward? Everybody was, you know, in support and until
right. And at the end of the day, it's not so much the power of the Secretary General, but there's power of the commanding media attention where it counts, because the US obviously can ignore any UN resolution, and it has many times in the past.
All the time.
Israel can ignore UN resolutions, knowing the US, you know, will veto and support it. So the only leverage really that the Secretary General has is the commanding global media. Secretary General cannot make a statement that will not be beamed around the world. And that is why it's important when he took that position against the bombing. I think that, of course, has impact in other countries as well.
Yeah, it also goes back to what we said when we had our UN session, that it's a useless entity as far as actually the bigger picture, right? Because if the US is going to do what it wants and is not held accountable by the UN policy, and if Israel, and not if, by the way, because we are seeing it happen now, right? I saw a clip or a headline apparently that the South African president was asking the US or the Western nations, if you all have a warrant, I'm going to call it a warrant out for Putin, why don't you have one out for Netanyahu?
Right.
Oh, well, I mean, two human rights bodies have dragged Netanyahu to the International Criminal Court of Justice. So we'll see whether an indictment comes out of that.
Right. And the sad thing is that if he's not indicted,
yeah, then
it will completely demolish the ICC. With credibility would be completely shot. Its jurisdiction would not be taken seriously at all. And the sad thing is that Netanyahu actually has never wanted a two-state solution. He opposed the Oslo Accord,
yeah,
signed by Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. Remember? And in fact, Rabin paid with his life
yeah,
for signing that accord that would
back.
recognize a Palestinian state alongside Israel. He was assassinated in 1995, the same year that he had signed it, Oslo II, because Oslo I was 73 with Clinton. So this guy has actually been an obstacle to peace between Israel and the Palestinians. In fact, and anybody who's not familiar with this can Google and do the research, he boosted Hamas because he wanted to say that, oh, look at this terrorist organization. How can I negotiate with them? I really want peace, but I don't have
a partner, a peace partner
to negotiate. That's how cynical he has been.
And when you mentioned what's his name, Netanyahu, he does have an arrest warrant on him and 4 other Israeli generals.
Oh, for domestic crimes?
Yeah, for crimes against humanity. There's an arrest warrant issued by, because the Belgians have this government judicial system where one of their citizens can bring a case. Case.
Oh yeah, Spain has that too. I think several of the EU countries have that.
So there's a couple of, and the reason why I say this, and it's funny because something happened a couple of years ago. not Benjamin Netanyahu, 2 of those generals came to London but they didn't know that that arrest warrant was out. The moment they heard, they couldn't leave their plane.
Right.
The plane literally had to fly them back out.
Right. No, I know. You're right. That I remember also Pinochet. Remember Pinochet?
Exactly.
Pinochet, the same
There you
thing.
go.
He came to London. He could not leave his hotel because technically they had to arrest him.
They had to arrest him.
The same thing with Rwanda's Minister of Defense a few years ago. Now he's a former minister. Kabarehe.
Yeah.
The same thing in the UK. He was arrested in London. And then Tony Blair interceded because he was doing PR for Kagame, and they released him. Yeah, I remember that.
So to bring it back to Rhodesia, when the sanction was called at the General Assembly to place sanctions on, like you said, two countries vetoed it actually, Britain and the United States. Following out from that was the stepping up of the arms campaign. And when I say the arms campaign, the Zanla, the armed wing of ZANU, decided, we have to take it to the people. Now, here was the curious thing about taking it to the people.
No, and ZAPU too. So we have to give.
Yeah, ZAPU. Yes, ZAPU.
ZANU and ZAPU.
Yeah, ZANU and ZAPU. So here's the critical thing. While they took it to the people, do you know that people actually walked for miles to go and volunteer? And I mean men and women to go and volunteer to fight.
Yep.
So it wasn't just the fact that a group or a band of people decided this was what we're going to do. It was actually the people who decided, what's the use of doing this? Wherein this is actually the path to how we need to proceed. And so when the massacre happened in Mozambique, wherein the Rhodesian forces came in and bombed a refugee site, it played well into the fact that the world was able to then project all of that imagery onto the front of newspapers, not just within the African countries, but also, international news media. Right. And that highlighted the fact that now we have a problem on our hands. By that, I'm saying media plays a key role in how a struggle is framed.
Absolutely.
If the media was not involved in that fight, we probably will still be fighting in the bush.
Right. And we have to also give credit to the fact that the resistance we were able to internationalize it in such a way that sisters and brothers on the ground here in the US became part, they became part of it. They would counter the absurd white supremacist, media. They're able to push back on behalf of, sisters and brothers on the continent. So that played a very big role. The emergence of organizations like Trans-Africa, led by the late Randall Robinson.
Yes.
Who joined the Ancestors last year. I'm glad I had some conversations with him before he joined the Ancestors. I wasn't aware of, his illness. But he led Trans-Africa, which was very effective in mobilizing protest in front of the embassies of South Africa. And he kept the rallying cry against the Ian Smith minority regime in Rhodesia also alive. So yeah, the global opinion matters a lot.
Speaking of the power of the pen, two great writers actually centered the Rhodesian struggle. As from time to time they'll write essays, and by that I mean the elder Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe actually went to Rhodesia. 79. Is it 79? Yes, 79. 79. Yeah, just as they were coming, and will recount in his essays that it's not only that people have the right to be free,
Mhm.
but also the right to think and just write. Because at that time he was fronting the Africa's Writers series, and he was looking for somebody from Zimbabwe to front the country. Obviously, Africa is replete with writing talents, you know. So it follows on that he was going in, but in so doing, his presence alone also brought focus, because once someone like that comes to you, the media gaze follows.
Mhm.
What
Correct.
he sees is what the media then sees.
And
So
people, they read what he writes also, and his
exactly,
opinion has impact.
exactly.
Right.
And so everything begins to tide. Nadim Godima from South Africa also penned a series of op-eds, that despite, living in South Africa, although that will throw up so many other issues, but all the same, she did her bit. And the rest, as they say, is history. And then when you said intentionalize, there is one thing I want to add before I pass it on to you, sister, was building the struggle. They first of all coined a name for their struggle so that people do not forget it. So the first name, I said the first name as if there was any other one. The first and the only other, the name they used was called the Chimurenga
Right.
in Mashona, meaning the struggle.
Yeah.
So the first one was, there were two struggles. Chimurenga 1 was when Rhodes initially came in and decided, you know what, he wanted their land and he was going to kill them. And so they fought. That was 1896 to 1897.
Led by Nyehanda.
That's the lady mentioned earlier. Yes. And then subsequent one was the one that they started in 1972.
Right. And they named it Chimurenga 2 in honor of Nyehanda, actually.
Nyehanda, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it goes on that we follow in the footsteps of our ancestors.
Absolutely.
You do not, there is nothing you're creating anew. You're following on from what has gone before. And so this break that often you read on t-shirts like, I am not my ancestors. I wonder where that stupid idea came from.
Right.
So, and before, I was going to say, what was I going to? Yeah. I was going to say, following on from that struggle, they took help, got help from the Mozambicans. By that, I mean the likes of the great Samora Machel, who said, we have decided to open up a pipeline so that you can come in and, build from here, and decided, you know what, your fight is our fight.
They even gave them a base, right? In Mozambique.
Tete. So yeah, and they operated out of there. And from time to time, obviously, the Air Force will come in and try and raid. But again, like I said, because they had their network of informers, they knew beforehand that these guys were coming. And so the camps will usually be empty.
Right. The support that Mozambique and the Samora gave to the freedom fighters in what became Zimbabwe also led to the total destruction of Mozambique. And Mozambique never recovered.
To this day.
It became much, much weakened and ultimately led to the killing of Samora himself in that so-called airplane accident. Because they bombed Mozambique massively. And then they trained Renamo.
That's
the most brutal reaction. Now, that is a terrorist organization. Absolutely, 100%. They did not even target armed forces. They killed only civilians. They blew up hospitals. They blew up schools. They blew up rail tracks.
Which is what is happening now.
Absolutely. And trained by Rhodesia and South Africa with U.S. financing. Completely derailed any hope of the revolution succeeding in Mozambique. So Mozambique won its independence in 1975. That same year, the U.S. reactionary campaign against Mozambique started. It was so effective and so destructive that Samora Machel, the leader and the hero of Mozambique Revolution, had to come visit Ronald Reagan in the White House. That to me was the ultimate sign of having to kneel down and saying, you have won. That's how much they destroyed Mozambique. Yeah. And even then, they still took his life. Anyway, you know.
Do you know, I mean, just to add to that before Sister goes, how barbaric they were. You mean
Renamo?
Yeah, Renamo. Right. They're not what's it called? The national, what do they call them again? National Reserve. There's a famous National Reserve. They literally wiped out all the animals in that reserve. One of the largest in Africa. Wiped it out completely. The animals.
For no beneficial reason.
For no beneficial reason.
For me, as you say that, Adesoji, right? A lot of people ask me, why are you so hateful, Nduku? Because of the way I speak. And because I caution us against white folk, having them in our rooms when we're planning and all that. And I'm not saying hate white people. I'm just saying be cautious, right? And it's not just white folk we see now, by the way. It's also Black folk who have embraced this nonsensical idea that apparently whiteness is better than Blackness. But also those Black people are doing that for money and for position and for power, right? So the two things that I wanted to mention as you were talking, Allimadi, is that support that the Africans, the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States were giving Zimbabwe, because it's important for us to show how, I say this because we have a lot of descendants of enslaved Africans in the US now trying to stay within the borders, talking about ADOS, and they don't see themselves beyond their American borders. But back then, during the civil rights movement, what happened in Africa, what happened to Black people elsewhere was the concern of the Africans within the United States. And because of them, a lot of policies, a lot of things that were going to happen in Zimbabwe were held back because of the push here. Even during those democratic leadership presidencies, it was because of the Black vote that they held back and did not support Rhodesia as much. So that should be reminded to all of us, like as Adesoji says, learning from our past and using it now. All Black people in the United States, the condition and the wellness of Africa should be a concern for all of us. The other thing I have written here as you were speaking, I remembered as you were speaking, when the US was in talks about getting rid of Patrice Lumumba, one of the agents, and this reminds me of the two planes, Samaras and the Secretary General, he volunteered. Apparently, one thing we're good at is at being sharpshooters or something. I'm paraphrasing what he said, and so it goes back again to the story that goes that the planes were shot down from Rhodesia, but also that we, as we continue to talk about this and educate ourselves to understand exactly who our enemy is, it's not just the nation front that you see, it is also the different parts of that nation, private and what's it called, official, that are involved, because the CIA, what it does, it builds fronts in private companies. And it's not just the CIA, the many intelligence units. It appears as a private company, but it is them working in Africa and continuing to control policy, continuing to hinder Africans from getting liberation. So just something I wanted to mention as we were talking.
Right. And of course, at the end of the day, it ties back to us also making sure that we fight for good African leadership. We fight to have more leaders like Thomas Sankara, who are willing to actually sacrifice for the benefit of the African people. And it shows you how the right leadership can actually change a lot of these things, because it's not as complex as it sometimes appears. It's just wanting to represent the interest of the masses of the population instead of individual interest. So as Samir Amin put it, and if we just focus on the economics for a minute, he said the Zambian president, I don't remember which president it was, had asked him for advice. How should he deal with China? Because China wants Zambia's resources, including copper.
Well, I mean, Kenneth Kaunda.
No. It was much more recent. Not
Chiluba?
No, Chiluba is too corrupt. one of the ones after Chiluba. And ironically, used to be a union leader. But hey, why are we surprised? Look at Ramaphosa. No, Museveni never led any union except a union of thieves. But here's what Samir Amin said. Samir Amin said, China will give you anything you want, including $10 million, $100 million in your personal bank account. But what do you really want for Zambia? That's the most important thing. If you want some money and technology, that's the way you can benefit the people of Zambia. Because with technology, you now build your own Zambian-owned factories that can use Zambia's copper to manufacture within Zambia. So now you're creating skilled employment and you are creating value-added products. Whatever merchandise that they use copper to make, you're making it in Zambia, exporting it at a much higher value and getting more revenue than just packing these copper ores in containers and shipping it like that, selling it literally. Sounds like a lot of money, but it's pennies compared to
what is possible
producing and then sending the manufactured product. So that's the advice he gave. So all these leaders are in control of certain resources that the industrialized, wealthy countries want. If they all adopt that kind of formula suggested by Samir Amin, that itself would transform the societies within, a decade, within 10 years,
Yeah. I was going to most definitely, Brother Allimadi, go to the audience, Adesoji. I was looking at unless you all had something else to say.
No, I was going to mention one of the key tenets of the Rhodesian government prior to us moving on is displacement.
Yes.
Which is happening now.
Yes.
You mentioned there were 6.2% of the population at that time. But that 6.2% of the population held more than 80% of the arable land of the place. Right. And they made sure that your lands were basically, how can I say it, not fit for human habitation. But if you wanted to work, you can live on their farm and you will even pay rent to them.
Yeah, like a sharecropper. That's what they call it
exactly,
here.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, looking at the parallels of today, are we seeing the same thing in terms of displacements? So, obviously, that level of humiliation will push anyone to react. And so, when you do react, you are not giving the benefit of the doubt. Somebody asked the question in the media the other day, how is it that the Ukrainians are, they're resisting oppression while the Palestinians are...
The Ukrainians are not
resisting?
So the Ukrainians...
It's the United States and NATO that is fighting against Russia.
What?
That's my response.
Yeah, but give me the benefit of the doubt. Let me... I mean, the Ukrainians are fighting to defend their homeland. You guys can color it any which way, but I see the blue-yellow flag. And that's what I see. I see Ukraine.
The question should be, why have they
No,
not
let him
been
finish.
those
Let him finish his
terrorists?
point. Let him finish his point.
Sorry.
So the question was if the Ukrainians can defend or against external aggression, why is it that the Palestinians cannot do the same thing?
It depends on who they're fighting. That's the point. Who are they defending themselves against?
The Palestinians
Russia is an enemy.
Do not have an armed force. They don't find an armed force. You cannot defend yourself when you're fighting a powerful armed force. And I think maybe we should go to the audience, but I would like to make this observation. I think the most tragic thing is that the Palestinians have been abandoned by their past supporters, the neighboring Arab countries, and the African continent as well. So they're literally on their own right now. And in the absence of having the kind of support they had in the past, nobody should be surprised that we are going to see more acts of what is called terrorism in the absence of conventional warfare. If the people who are fighting against Ian Smith's regime did not have the support of the patriotic African countries, the frontline states, we might have seen similar type of conflict in that part of the world. But they had the full backing of those countries. And that is the key difference right now. And of course, if Ukraine did not have the full backing of the United States, it would be a province of Russia by now.
Yep.
It
always depends on who's being fought, right? And how the United States views them. Zimbabwe is currently compensating previous occupiers for them making improvements to the land. I think that's BS and a failure of liberation. Remind me of reparations to France from... Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
100% spot on.
Spot on.
You can't add much to that, but it also shows you the extent of the defeat of those African countries. It's very similar to what I said when Samora Machel was compelled to come and meet with Ronald Reagan. Literally, he was,
come and kiss the ring.
Exactly, begging for more time to exist, but that didn't even matter. So in the case of Zimbabwe, it goes back to the same problem that Sankara faced, right? You can't really resist alone. Although I give Thabo Mbeki maximum credit for rejecting the pressure from Tony Blair that he should join in a British military expedition against Zimbabwe after the land reform. So that was, who knows what might have happened if Cyril Ramaphosa
had been in power
with the president at that time, right?
And it's one of the reasons.
I think Zuma, for whatever his, financial picadillos, I think at least he, was a Pan-African too. I don't think Zuma would have also agreed to invade Zimbabwe. So that's what we face now. Africa brought to its knees. So now Zimbabwe was taking out a loan of what? Was it $2 or $3 billion to compensate the European farmers. So African taxpayers are going to burden that because they're the ones that are going to have to repay the loan, right? So the Africans are buying back the land from the Europeans that was stolen from Africans' ancestors by the ancestors of the Europeans.
And the same thing happens in Kenya as well.
Yes.
And I don't know if I cut you off, Brother Allimadi.
No, I'm done.
Yeah. So my question is why, on both cases, as we look at this, in Kenya, in Haiti, in Zimbabwe, why any? I mean, I know the answer, but let's go ahead and ask it. Why any reasonable African who wants to claim that they are an independent nation would say yes to such nonsense?
I think Thomas Sankara answered that question with his life. When he said, if I do it alone and renounce the debt, I will not attend next year's OAU conference. That was in July 1987. October 15, 1987, he met his end. So that is actually the reason why.
And to add to what you said, we also have to understand that, although, when I say understand, I mean putting things into context here, that the country was virtually on its knees. They've been sanctioned since 2011.
Yes, actually, you're right. How many countries could still survive?
Exactly. And so it was a question of, do you want more of that? Do you want more of that, or you want this? Okay, you want the land? Okay, eat the soil, but you're not going to get capital. So
and Adesoji, the big shame here is that Nigeria, supposedly a powerful country, South Africa, supposedly a powerful country, Ghana, supposedly a powerful country. If it's all these other countries could not come together and say, listen, deal with us.
Produce anything,
we'll make this work. So at the end of the day, no matter how we see it, it still comes back to collective African leadership failure. We don't discount the attacks from the outside enemies of Africa.
Of course, it will come. It will come.
In order to deal with this entire thing, we have to also deal with the domestic issues and contradictions that we have on our beloved motherland.
I mean, I'll just quickly say something. Nkrumah did say it in his speech at the inaugural meeting of the OAU, May 25, 1963. They've not quite gone. They're still at the window, waiting to come back in. And this is it.
And that window is open.
They're not even at the window. They are sitting on the carpet. They're right there. You just don't see them, but they're sitting right next to you on the couch. In fact, they're cooking right next to you.
Or when you hear things moving under your bed.
No, for real.
You think it's the cat.
Which is why I keep bringing up the CIA and the intelligence agencies, which is why I keep bringing them up, because those are the entities that they use to influence. So when you see an African president all of a sudden changing their mind on policy, when you see them bringing up policy, you're like, who's this? When they were running, they were saying this. Now that they're president, they're doing this. Yeah. As I was reading these books, I was like, they have Ruto. They 100% have Ruto.
Yeah.
He is not himself.
He's not.
The policies he's putting up is not him. He is under pressure. Yeah, he is being squeezed.
And with Ruto, I can understand why. They have that ICC thing over his head.
Yes.
And they can exercise that at any minute. You see? All they have to do is say, hey.
Which is why.
Because people mistakenly think that case ended. It did not. It was suspended. The difference between ending a case and suspending
a case.
Suspending meaning it can be revived at any
time.
So do you think Ruto wants it to be revived?
Here's the funny thing though. Ruto is a wealthy man. He could have just stayed on his farm and lived a happy life. Don't meddle in politics if you have some dirty laundry. Just don't.
But no, that wasn't him. That wasn't
being president, you know.
No, I mean, besides, that wasn't
the title.
That wasn't him meddling. That was him being told.
I agree with
this.
You're going to be the president.
You are going to do this.
I think it's spot on.
Meddling.
You must run.
You must run.
But I don't want to be president. What do you mean? It's not your choice.
No,
let's stop laughing about this because
but I think he's right.
Yeah.
That's the serious part. You will run.
He's spot on.
You would run.
It's as they said
and
in that famous movie, an offer you can't refuse.
But refuse.
Again, we will definitely have a show based on white malice. We must have a show based on that.
We should.
Everything that's revealed.
You would run and you would win.
Yes. Are you sure I'll win? Of course.
Of course.
On that note, I am done.
We know the result.
I
think we've run out of time anyway.
You can take this promise to the bank. You would win. In fact, put Mr. Excellency before your name.
Mr. Dam
now
Dam as your vice president.
Every pronouncement he's made so far fits into
The narrative.
Yes.
Perfectly.
As they will say, he's a made man.
Yep.
In mafia circles.
There were several comments, one on technology. We've talked about this before. Quickly, as we wrap up, if we go for technology in Africa, we must make sure that it's not oppressing and exploiting
I agree.
Africans, because currently the situation in Congo, that's another show we're going to have.
I agree.
Yeah. So Adesoji, if you want to.
Oh, yes. Have you guys had your final word?
Well,
I'm good. You all finished me with Ruto.
Okay. Well, I think I'm glad that we talked about the need for us to counter demonization of non-European peoples. We talked about that consistently in today's episode, because at the end of the day, that is what we need. We need Europeans to understand that we won't accept white supremacy, but we also need non-Europeans not to accept white supremacy.
I think that's our biggest problem right now that we're
that's
talking.
the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
So that's my final word.
Okay.
Karibuni, and thank you for joining us today.
So yes, my final word is actually is a statement, in the sense that again, we talked about settler colonialism and how you could draw parallels between what transpired before. I mean, you can just look at Africa and, transpose it to any part where Western imperialism thrives or, goes to. But I'll leave you with this. 17th of April, 1980, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. And at the ceremony was the man himself, Robert Nesta Marley. And he said, African people came to liberate Zimbabwe. Yep. And so, people, continue to liberate your mind, which is what we do here. And we'll see you next week.
Asanteni. Peace.
Go ahead.